Envision yourself wading through an endless cemetery of liquid earth. Each footstep constitutes a battle against suction forces. You haven't experienced sleep in 96 hours because no dry terrain exists anywhere. If you cease forward motion, you sink gradually. If you collapse, the mud consumes you entirely. Warriors are suffocating while remaining vertical, too depleted to elevate their skulls above the waterline. And commanding this procession of the condemned rides a figure atop the final surviving elephant. He clutches the control straps with fever-racked hands. His right optical organ has swollen completely shut, discharging infection. Pulsating with agony so intense it would incapacitate ordinary combatants. Yet he doesn't halt forward progress. He doesn't vocalize distress. He merely continues advancing relentlessly. This constitutes the savage reality of 217 BC, and the individual destroying his own physical form to annihilate Rome is Hannibal Barca. Before exploring this relentless chronicle of endurance and vengeance, if you value uncovering history's concealed truths, hit that like button and subscribe. And please comment below to tell me where you're listening from. It's amazing to see how we're connected across the world by our curiosity for the past. The traversal of the Arno Marshes wasn't a military march. It constituted a slow-motion catastrophe. Most historical texts gloss over this segment. They discuss the Alps extensively, but the Alps merely represented cold temperatures. The marshes represented lethality itself. For 4 consecutive days and 3 consecutive nights, Hannibal's military force didn't contact dry ground. They didn't establish a camp. They didn't prepare food. They simply walked continuously. The suction proved gruesome. Combatants at the column's front churned the terrain into deep slurry. By the time rearguard units arrived at the same location, they were traversing through liquid filth. When exhaustion finally struck individuals, warriors didn't recline on terrain. They climbed onto the bloated carcasses of deceased pack animals merely to maintain their craniums above the waterline for brief minutes of unconsciousness. They utilized corpses as floating platforms. This represents the desperation level Hannibal demanded, and he personally paid the price physically. Riding atop Surus, his war elephant, Hannibal was elevated above the mud, yet he couldn't escape bacterial infection. The swamp microorganisms settled into his right optical organ. The inflammation proved catastrophic. He possessed no medical practitioners, no sanitary bandages, and absolutely zero time to halt. He simply permitted the eye to expire. He sacrificed half his visual capacity to maintain army momentum. Why engage in such self-destruction? Why drive military forces through a route that exterminates them faster than enemy forces? Because velocity constitutes the most lethal weapon available. The Roman consul Flaminius was positioned on the primary road, guarding the accessible path, confident that no military force could survive the marshes. His confidence proved erroneous. Hannibal didn't merely flank the Romans tactically. He materialized behind them like an apparition. When his military force finally stumbled onto dry terrain in Etruria, encrusted in mud and half-blind, they had achieved the impossible. They had bypassed every fortification Rome had constructed. The shock wasn't merely tactical, it was psychological warfare. Hannibal demonstrated he would endure any suffering, traverse any hellscape, merely to position his hands around Rome's throat. But an individual who can permit his own optical organ rotting from his skull for strategic purposes isn't manufactured overnight. That variety of discipline, that obsession, is engineered systematically. To comprehend the monster who emerged from the swamp, we must abandon the mud of Italy and travel back 2 decades. We must journey to a temple in Carthage where a father is about to hand his 9-year-old son a blade, and a choice that will incinerate the world. To comprehend the individual who could forfeit an eye without flinching, we must comprehend the architect who constructed him. Hannibal wasn't born a monster. He was meticulously engineered. His creator was his father, Hannibal Barca, a man whose very name Barca translates to lightning. And like lightning, Hamilcar was brilliant, terrifying, and destructive. Let's transport ourselves to Carthage in 241 BC. The First Punic War has just concluded. To the average citizen, it represented defeat, but to Hamilcar, it represented betrayal. He had combated the Romans in Sicily for years and remained undefeated in battlefield engagements. He was a tactical genius who ran circles around the clumsy Roman legions tactically. Yet while he was triumphing on battlefields, the politicians back home capitulated. They authorized a humiliating peace treaty that stripped Carthage of its wealth and its pride. Rome didn't merely triumph, they bullied Carthage, confiscating the islands of Sicily and Sardinia and demanding crippling war reparations. Hamilcar returned home not as a defeated general, but as an individual, consumed by cold, calculating rage. He comprehended that Rome could not be negotiated diplomatically. Rome represented an existential threat. It was a predator that would eventually consume Carthage alive unless it was destroyed first. But Hamilcar knew he was too chronologically advanced to complete this war personally. He required a legacy. He required a weapon that would outlive him. Enter Hannibal. The defining moment of Hannibal's existence occurred when he was merely 9 years old. It constitutes one of the most famous scenes in Roman Republican history, yet we often miss the psychological weight of it. Hamilcar was preparing to depart for Spain, or Iberia as it was designated then, to reconstruct the Carthaginian Empire and secure the silver and mines necessary to pay Rome's extortion fees. The young Hannibal begged to accompany him. He didn't desire staying in the soft luxury of the capital. He desired camp existence. Hamilcar agreed, but on one stipulation. He led the boy into the temple of Baal Hammon. Imagine the atmosphere: heavy incense smoke, the flickering illumination of sacrificial fires, the silence of the priests. In the ancient world, oaths weren't merely words. They were binding contracts with divine forces. Breaking an oath invited cosmic destruction. Hamilcar made his 9-year-old son place his small hand on the sacrificial victim, a freshly killed animal still warm with blood, and swear a solemn vow. The exact phrasing varies in the ancient texts, but the sentiment was absolute. I swear that as soon as age will permit, I will use fire and steel to arrest the destiny of Rome. This wasn't merely a promise, it was a psychological anchor. From that moment forward, Hannibal's existence possessed a singular purpose. He wasn't raised as a prince, he was raised as a soldier. Hamilcar transported him to Spain, far away from the corrupting influence of the Carthaginian Senate. For the next decade, Hannibal's classroom was the battlefield. This is crucial to understanding the Carthage versus Rome dynamic. While Roman aristocrats were learning rhetoric and law in the forum, Hannibal was learning how to sleep on hard ground, how to endure hunger, and how to kill efficiently. He consumed the same food as common soldiers. He dressed identically to them. He fought beside them. Hamilcar was teaching him a vital lesson. Loyalty is not purchased with gold. It is earned through shared suffering. This upbringing created a unique psychological profile. Hannibal was a high-born noble, with the instincts of a common soldier. He could discuss philosophy with Greek tutors in one moment and sever a limb in combat the next. He learned to read terrain like cartography and to read men like literature. Most importantly, he observed his father fight. He absorbed Hamilcar's tactics, his utilization of ambushes, his reliance on velocity, the lightning style of warfare. But Hamilcar's time expired prematurely. In 228 BC, during a skirmish with local tribes, Hamilcar was cornered tactically. To save his sons, he drew the enemy away deliberately and drowned in a river. Hannibal, now 18, observed his father perish. The architect was gone, but the weapon was finished. The hatred for Rome had been tempered by years of discipline and grief. When Hannibal eventually assumed command of the army at age 26, he wasn't merely a general. He was the manifestation of his father's ghost. He possessed the world's best army, a multicultural force of Libyans, Numidians, and Iberians, all fanatically loyal to the Barca family, not to the city of Carthage. And he possessed a strategy. He wasn't going to wait for Rome to initiate the Second Punic War. He was going to transport the war to them. He was going to execute the unthinkable. He looked northward toward the mountains that no army had ever crossed in force. The Alps were calling. In late 218 BC, Hannibal executed something that military experts declared impossible. He looked at the Alps, the massive frozen mountain range serving as the natural fortress of Italy, and decided to walk over it. To comprehend the insanity of this decision, you must realize that, in the ancient mind, the Alps weren't merely mountains. They were the edge of the known world, a place where gods resided and where humans perished. The logistics alone were a nightmare scenario. Hannibal wasn't merely hiking with a backpack. He was moving a city. He possessed roughly 50,000 infantry, 9,000 cavalry, and 37 war elephants. Imagine the caloric requirements. An elephant consumes approximately 300 pounds of food daily. In the barren, snow-covered peaks, no grass exists. Every scrap of food had to be carried. This wasn't a march, it was a race against starvation. And the mountains were not vacant. They were inhabited by hostile Gallic tribes who perceived this massive army as a slow-moving target. As the Carthaginian columns stretched for miles along narrow icy ledges, the tribesmen ambushed them from elevated positions. They rolled massive boulders down the cliffs, crushing warriors and horses, sending them screaming into the abyss below. It was a massacre in slow motion. Hannibal had to fight a vertical war, dispatching his light infantry to scramble up the cliffs and seize the high ground merely to stop the rain of rocks. But the true adversary was the cold. As they climbed higher, the autumn snows commenced falling. The path disappeared completely. Warriors who had grown up in the heat of Africa and Spain were now freezing to death in their armor. Animals slipped on the ice, taking their handlers with them over the edge. The psychological toll was immense. Every step was a gamble with mortality. Then they encountered the roadblock. A massive landslide had swept away the path on a steep cliffside. There was a drop of 1,000 feet on one side and a sheer rock wall on the other. The army was trapped. They couldn't retreat, the tribes were behind them, and they couldn't advance. They were stuck on a freezing ledge with supplies depleting. This is where Hannibal's genius shifted from tactical to engineering. He didn't panic, he utilized science. He ordered his warriors to cut down the few stunted trees in the area and pile the wood around the massive boulders blocking the path. They set the wood ablaze. They waited until the rocks were glowing red hot. Then Hannibal ordered his warriors to pour their rations of sour wine, essentially vinegar, onto the heated stone. It was primitive chemical engineering. The thermal shock of the cold liquid hitting the superheated rock caused the stone to shatter and crumble. It worked. The soldiers utilized pickaxes to clear the debris, carving a new path into the cliffside. They worked in shifts, desperate and starving, until the path was wide enough for the elephants to pass. The descent into Italy was ironically deadlier than the ascent. These southern slopes were steeper and covered in slippery ice concealed beneath fresh snow. Warriors would step on what appeared to be solid ground and slide uncontrollably to their deaths. But finally, after 15 days of hell, the army staggered out of the mountains and into the Po Valley. The cost was staggering. Hannibal had entered the Alps with nearly 60,000 warriors. He emerged with barely 26,000. He had forfeited nearly half his army and many of his elephants to the cold and the cliffs. He arrived in Italy, gaunt, exhausted, and vastly outnumbered by the Roman legions waiting for him. But he had achieved the one thing Rome never expected. He was there. The Roman Senate was in panic. They had assumed the Alps were an impenetrable shield. Now the monster was in their backyard. The crossing of the Alps wasn't merely a movement of troops. It was a statement. It told Rome that no barrier, natural or man-made, could keep Hannibal Barca out. The invasion had commenced. By the spring of 217 BC, Hannibal was deep inside Italy. He had survived the Alps and the marshes, but survival wasn't sufficient. He required a victory so devastating that it would shatter Rome's confidence. To accomplish that, he didn't search for a battlefield. He searched for a victim. His target was Gaius Flaminius, a Roman consul who was brave, patriotic, and fatally arrogant. Hannibal knew Flaminius wasn't the type to sit and wait defensively. He was a politician who required a quick victory to satisfy the voters back in Rome. So Hannibal commenced a campaign of psychological torture. He marched his army past Flaminius's camp, burning villages and destroying crops, but refusing to engage in combat. He was essentially slapping Flaminius in the face, daring him to emerge. Flaminius took the bait. Enraged, he ordered his legions to pursue Hannibal, marching rapidly, abandoning proper reconnaissance. He was chasing a ghost, and that ghost was leading him straight into a meat grinder. The location Hannibal selected was Lake Trasimene. Geographically, it was a natural death trap. A narrow road ran along the northern shore of the lake, squeezed between the water on one side and steep forested hills on the other. On the morning of June 21st, a thick, heavy fog rolled in off the lake. It blanketed the valley floor, reducing visibility to almost zero. Hannibal had concealed his entire army, cavalry, infantry, and slingers, in the hills above the road, perfectly concealed by the tree line and the fog. Below, the Roman army marched in a long, disorganized column. They couldn't see the enemy above them. They couldn't even see the end of their own line. They thought Hannibal was days ahead, fleeing in terror. Then the signal was given. Suddenly the hills came alive. Thousands of Carthaginian soldiers charged down the slopes, crashing into the flank of the Roman column. Because of the fog, the Romans didn't even know they were under attack until the spears were already in their chests. It wasn't a battle. It was an execution. The Romans were trapped. If they turned left, they hit the Carthaginian shield wall. If they turned right, they were pushed into the deep waters of the lake. Thousands of warriors, weighed down by heavy armour, were driven into the mud and drowned. The water turned so red with blood that to this day, a small stream in the area is named Sanguinetto, the place of blood. But here is the detail that truly captures the intensity of this massacre. A detail so rare and shocking it sounds like fiction. While this slaughter was taking place, a massive earthquake struck the region. It was powerful enough to topple statues in nearby cities, divert rivers, and trigger landslides in the very mountains they were fighting on. Yet the Roman historian, Livy, records that not a single soldier on the battlefield noticed it. They were so consumed by the adrenaline of survival, so locked in the frenzy of killing and dying, that the earth literally shook beneath their feet and nobody felt it. That is the definition of total war. In less than 3 hours, 15,000 Romans were killed. Another 10,000 were captured. Flaminius himself was decapitated by a Gallic horseman, his head mounted on a spear. The Roman army in the north had effectively ceased to exist. When the news reached Rome, the Senate didn't attempt to spin it. A magistrate walked out to the weeping crowd in the forum and simply stated, "We have been defeated in a great battle." Panic swept the city. The bridges over the Tiber were destroyed. Women prayed in the temples, expecting Hannibal to march through the gates at any moment. But Hannibal didn't march on Rome, not yet. He knew he couldn't capture a fortified city of that magnitude without siege equipment. Instead, he turned south. He was preparing for his masterpiece. Trasimene was a tragedy for Rome, but what was coming next would be an apocalypse. He was heading toward a dusty plain called Cannae. August 2nd, 216 BC, the Apulian flatlands adjacent to the settlement of Cannae. The sun scorches without mercy, and a scorching breeze designated the Vulturnus propels sand and particles straight into Roman facial features. Rome had exhausted its tolerance for deceptive tactics. They had concluded their patience with surprise attacks concealed by meteorological conditions and wetlands. They resolved to address the Hannibal dilemma through overwhelming force exclusively. They constructed the most colossal military force throughout their chronological existence. 8 legions supplemented by allies, approximately 86,000 combatants. It constituted a crushing instrument engineered to flatten Hannibal's military force against terrain. Commanding them was Consul Terentius Varro, a person who considered tactical sophistication evidence of cowardice. Hannibal, outnumbered approaching 2-to-1 ratios, performed something resembling self-destruction. He organized his infantry into a convex crescent formation, protruding outward toward Romans, yet he positioned his most vulnerable soldiers, the Gauls and Iberians, at the center of that protrusion. He stationed his elite African heavy infantry on distant wings, concealed behind the curved formation. It constituted a trap fabricated from human tissue. When the colossal Roman formation collided with the Carthaginian line center, the collision was earth-shattering. The Gauls positioned centrally held briefly, then initiated withdrawal. They didn't fragment organizationally. They retreated gradually, combating every increment. The Romans, detecting approaching triumph, pushed forward aggressively. They penetrated deeper continuously, vocalizing triumphantly, convinced they were fragmenting Hannibal's defensive line. They weren't fragmenting it whatsoever. They were penetrating into it. As the central portion withdrew, the formation inverted geometrically. The convex configuration transformed into a concave receptacle. The Romans were presently channeling themselves into an extermination chamber. Abruptly, Hannibal issued the directive. The elite African infantry, positioned on flanks, pivoted inward, like shutting portals, striking Roman flanks. Simultaneously, the Carthaginian cavalry, having previously pursued Roman horsemen from the battlefield, returned and crashed into the Roman posterior. The confinement was sealed. The bilateral encirclement was finalized. Yet this is where historical texts typically terminate, and the authentic horror commences. We must address the slaughter's physical mechanics. This constitutes the compression phenomenon. Envision 80,000 combatants compressed into territory that progressively diminishes. As the Carthaginian ring constricted, the Romans were compressed together so intensely that they couldn't elevate their limbs to oscillate their blades. They were compressed shoulder against shoulder, thorax against dorsum. The particulate matter elevated by the conflict was vision impairing. The thermal conditions were asphyxiating. Terror established itself. The combatants positioned centrally couldn't observe adversaries. They could exclusively perceive the vocalizations of their companions expiring on peripheral zones. They were crushed by their own military forces' mass. Historical documentation describes combatants excavating cavities in terrain and interring their craniums in soil merely to asphyxiate themselves and evade the terror. Others were discovered with their hamstring tendons severed. Hannibal's combatants would lacerate the lower extremities of peripheral Romans to incapacitate them, advance to exterminate the subsequent standing combatant, and return to finalize the incapacitated ones subsequently. It wasn't combat. Presently, it constituted industrial magnitude butchery. For multiple hours, the Carthaginians hacked at the confined mass. It is calculated that at the slaughter's apex, approximately 600 Roman combatants were perishing every minute. That constitutes 10 human organisms extinguished every second. By solar descent, the terrain was silent. Exceeding 50,000 Romans reclined deceased. Among them were 80 senators and the consul Paulus. Rome had forfeited 20% of its complete adult masculine population in a solitary afternoon. The hemoglobin was so profound that the victors were obligated to scrape the viscera from their limbs merely to grasp their plunder. Hannibal had accomplished the impossible. He had obliterated a superior force through pure tactical geometry. The Battle of Cannae is continuously instructed in every military academy on Earth contemporary as the perfect engagement. Yet for the combatants positioned inside that circular formation, it constituted the day existence terminated. The solar orb descended on Canny's terrain, abandoning a quietness that was more substantial than combat noise. In the Carthaginian encampment, the festivities were unrestrained. They had executed the impossible. They had obliterated the Roman military force. The route to Rome appeared extensively accessible. That nocturnal period, inside Hannibal's command shelter, his cavalry commander, Hannibal, struck his closed hand on the furniture. He was euphoric, adrenaline continuously circulating through his vascular system. He observed Hannibal and formulated a daring proposition. Dispatch me forward with the cavalry, and in 5 solar rotations you shall consume nutrition in Rome's capital. It constituted the evident maneuver. Rome was protective mechanism absent. The legions were exterminated. The portals were accessible. Yet Hannibal occupied space there, gazing at the cartography, and oscillated his cranium negatively. He declined. He required temporal duration to recuperate his combatants, to accumulate siege apparatus, to strategize. Hannibal gazed at his commander in incredulity and vocalized one of military chronology's most celebrated phrases, Vincere scis, Hannibal, victoria uti nescis. You comprehend how to acquire a triumph, Hannibal, yet you don't comprehend how to utilize one. Was it an error? Historians have contested this for 2,000 chronological years. If Hannibal had advanced, could he have terminated the Roman Republic precisely then? Potentially. Yet Hannibal was a professional combatant, not a risk-taker. He recognized that Rome was a metropolitan area of elevated barriers and hundreds of thousands of citizens who would combat street by street. He didn't possess catapults, he didn't possess battering rams. He was wagering that Rome would conduct itself like a rational nation. In the ancient world, when you forfeit your military force, you petition for peaceful resolution. That constituted the regulation. So rather than advancing on Rome, Hannibal dispatched his sibling Mago, returning to Carthage to transmit the favourable intelligence. Mago ambulated into the Carthaginian Senate, a location that had been sceptical of Hannibal's military campaign, and he didn't formulate a verbal presentation. He simply inverted a colossal container onto the flooring. Thousands of golden circular bands spilled outward, reverberating onto the marble. In Rome, exclusively the equestrians, the elevated class, the mounted warriors, the senators, were permitted to don golden circular bands. Mago clarified that each circular band represented a noble Roman commander exterminated by Hannibal. The accumulation was so substantial it was obligated to be quantified by the peck measurement. It constituted undeniable verification that Rome's leadership had been decapitated. Yet while Carthage celebrated, Rome transformed. When the initial survivors from Cannae staggered returning to the metropolitan area, terror threatened dismantling the society. The vocalization, Hannibal ad portas, signifying Hannibal exists at the portals, reverberated in the passages. Yet then something frightening transpired. The Roman Senate convened, not to negotiate capitulation, yet to prohibit mourning. They authorized a decree forbidding females from weeping in public locations. They restricted the mourning temporal period to 30 solar rotations. They prohibited the vocalization, peaceful resolution. This wasn't stoicism. It constituted a psychotic fragmentation. They were so traumatized that they determined to repudiate actuality. Desperate to placate the divine entities, the civilized Romans reverted to barbarism. In the Forum Boreum, they interred 2 Gauls and 2 Greeks animate, a ceremonial human sacrifice to eliminate the negative omens. It demonstrated the profundity of their terror. They were prepared to execute anything to persist. And then the mobilization arrived. Rome extracted the container's bottom. They diminished the recruitment chronological age to male juveniles who hadn't even achieved puberty. They accessed the incarceration facilities and equipped the criminals. Most shockingly, they purchased 8,000 enslaved individuals from their proprietors, equipped them, and assured them liberation if they fought. They designated them Valones. Hannibal dispatched an envoy to Rome to negotiate a ransom for the thousands of captives he had acquired at Cannae. It constituted standard procedure. You remit financial compensation, I relinquish your combatants. The Roman Senate declined to even encounter the envoy. They proclaimed that any Roman who capitulated was not worth saving. They abandoned their own male offspring and siblings to deteriorate in Hannibal's encampments rather than bestow him a solitary coin of gold. This constituted the instant Hannibal comprehended he potentially had formulated a miscalculation. He had fragmented Rome's military force, yet he hadn't fragmented its cognitive apparatus. Actually, he had executed the antithesis. By striking them so intensely, he had extracted their humanity and transformed the Roman state into a cornered, rabid organism that would combat until the final hemoglobin droplet. The combat of tactical maneuvers was terminated. The combat of gradual depletion had commenced. For the subsequent 13 chronological years, a peculiar stalemate descended upon Italy. Hannibal was technically the victor. He advanced up and down the boot of Italy, unvanquished, plundering metropolitan areas and capturing settlements. Yet he was combating an apparition. Following the catastrophe at Cannae, Rome ultimately acquired its instruction. They comprehended that combating Hannibal in an accessible terrain was a mortality sentence, so they transferred the combat's control straps to an individual designated Quintus Fabius Maximus. His nickname was Cunctator, signifying the postponer. At the temporal period, the Romans detested him. They designated him a coward. They ridiculed him for declining to extract his blade. Yet Fabius was the exclusive individual sufficiently intelligent to comprehend the Second Punic War. He recognized Hannibal's vulnerability wasn't his tactical maneuvers, it was his provision line. Fabius introduced what we presently designate the Fabian tactical approach. It constituted a combat of obscurity. Wherever Hannibal travelled, Fabius pursued, yet he consistently remained on the elevated terrain, merely beyond grasp. If Hannibal relocated to the valley to procure nutritional provisions, Fabius was on the elevation observing. If Hannibal attempted to provoke him into a confrontation, Fabius remained positioned. More brutally, Fabius commanded a scorched terrain policy on his own nation. He incinerated Roman agricultural products, obliterated Roman agricultural structures, and evacuated Roman settlements before Hannibal arrived. He fundamentally starved his own population to guarantee Hannibal possessed nothing to consume. It constituted a cruel, unpopular, and absolutely brilliant tactical approach. Hannibal was presently the captive of Italy. He was like a feline predator in an enclosure. He could vocalize loudly, he could ambulate rhythmically, yet he couldn't depart. His military force was transforming as well. The hardened veterans who had traversed the Alps were expiring of chronological age or illness. They were substituted by local Italian mercenaries who didn't possess the identical fanatical loyalty or discipline. The acute periphery of the Carthaginian blade was deteriorating. Nevertheless, even in this gradual motion, asphyxiation, Hannibal's genius illuminated like lightning. There exists a celebrated narrative from the Ager Falernus region that demonstrates he was continuously the cognitive games master. Fabius had ultimately managed to confine Hannibal in a valley, obstructing all the mountain passages. It appeared like strategic victory. Yet that nocturnal period, the Roman sentries on the geographical ridges, observed something frightening. Thousands of illumination devices were relocating up the mountainside in obscurity. It appeared like the complete Carthaginian military force was initiating a desperate nocturnal assault over the summits. Fabius, cautious as consistently, relocated his combatants to intercept the illuminations. It constituted a deception. Hannibal had accumulated 2,000 bovine organisms, secured bundles of arid timber to their cranial protrusions, ignited them ablaze, and stampeded them up the mountain. While the Romans were occupied pursuing combusting livestock, Hannibal quietly advanced his authentic military force outward through the unguarded passage below. He had intellectually outsmarted them once more. Yet these instances of brilliance were becoming infrequent. The strategic actuality was grim. Hannibal received almost no assistance from Carthage. The politicians back home were envious of his triumph and declined dispatching significant reinforcements. He was isolated, and while Hannibal was confined executing feline and rodents in Italy, Rome was formulating maneuvers elsewhere. They comprehended that they couldn't exterminate the predator, so they decided to assault the predator's shelter. They dispatched military forces to Spain and Africa, and ascending through the Roman military forces' hierarchical positions was a young individual who had persisted at Cannae. He had analysed Hannibal not with apprehension, yet with fixation. He documented every manoeuvre, every deception, every formation. He was the exclusive Roman who didn't desire evading Hannibal. He desired transforming into Hannibal. His designation was Publius Cornelius Scipio, and he was about to transform the contest permanently. While Hannibal was gazing at combusting livestock in Italy, the authentic combat was being determined in Spain. The individual Rome dispatched there was Publius Cornelius Scipio. He was exclusively 25 chronological years, excessively young to legally command military forces. Yet, he was the exclusive individual prepared to accept the assignment. Why? Because his paternal figure and paternal sibling had both been exterminated by Hannibal's military forces. Scipio was disparate. He didn't combat like a Roman, he fought like Hannibal. He comprehended that combat wasn't concerning adherence to regulations, it was about exploitation of them. In 209 BC, Scipio targeted New Carthage, the capital of the Carthaginian Empire in Spain. It constituted a fortress encircled by aquatic substance on three sides, considered impregnable. Yet Scipio had executed his preparation. He acquired knowledge from local fishermen that the lagoon on the northern side drained drastically at reduced tidal conditions. Precisely like Hannibal utilised the Alps and the marshes, Scipio utilised the oceanic body. He anticipated the tidal condition to descend, and in a manoeuvre that appeared like divine intervention to his combatants, he advanced them through the shallow aquatic substance where the barriers were reduced and unguarded. They invaded the metropolitan area. In one afternoon, Scipio confiscated Carthage's financial treasury, its optimal artisans, and its hostages. He didn't merely triumph in an engagement, he confiscated Hannibal's financial resources. With Spain forfeited, Hannibal's circumstance in Italy became critical. He was depleting combatants. His final aspiration was his sibling, Hannibal Barca. Hasdrubal performed a supernatural occurrence of his own. He elevated a fresh military force in Spain and traversed the Alps, pursuing Hannibal's previous route. He was transporting fresh elephants, fresh gold, and 30,000 combatants to unite with his sibling in Italy. If they consolidated, Rome was condemned. Yet Rome had acquired knowledge of velocity's value. The Roman consul Nero, not the emperor, intercepted Hasdrubal's communication carriers. He acquired knowledge of the strategy. In a daring, compelled advance, Nero acquired 7,000 elite combatants, advanced northward in secrecy, and united forces with the northern Roman military force. They outnumbered Hasdrubal at the Battle of the Metaurus and obliterated him. Hannibal possessed no knowledge of this. He was anticipating in the south, examining the horizon for his siblings' banners. One morning, the Roman cavalry rode up to Hannibal's outpost. They didn't assault. They simply propelled a receptacle over the fortifications and rode distant. When Hannibal's guards accessed the receptacle, they discovered the severed cranium of Hannibal Barca. The Romans hadn't merely exterminated him. They had preserved the cranium so Hannibal would identify it. It constituted a communication of pure psychological brutality. Hannibal gazed at his siblings' facial features and reportedly articulated, "I observe that Carthage's destiny." He recognized it was terminated. The reinforcements were deceased. The provision lines were severed. Scipio had conquered Spain and was presently preparing to invade Africa itself. The Roman Senate ultimately recalled Scipio to strategize Carthage's invasion. Hannibal, the individual who had terrified Italy for 15 chronological years, received the directive he feared most: return home. He was obligated to abandon the veterans who had combated for him, exterminate his own equine animals because he couldn't transport them, and navigate returning to defend a metropolitan area that had never supported him. The stage was established for the terminal duel. Two combat masters, one aging legend and one ascending prodigy, were about to encounter Zama's sands. October 19th, 202 BC. The flatlands of Zama, south of Carthage. The atmospheric conditions are substantial, with particulate matter and the aroma of approaching violence. Following 16 chronological years of hemoglobin, the Second Punic War has descended to a solitary afternoon. Yet before the blades were extracted, something extraordinary transpired. An instance so cinematic it feels scripted by a playwright. Nevertheless, it's documented in historical texts. Hannibal and Scipio rode outward to encounter each other in the vacant territory between the military forces. Merely the duel of them with their interpreters. Envision the tension. On one side, Hannibal, presently approaching 50, a living legend, single optical organ, weathered, the individual who had haunted Rome's nocturnal terrors. On the alternative, Scipio, 33, aesthetically attractive, confident, unvanquished, the Roman Hannibal. Hannibal vocalized initially. He proposed a peaceful resolution. He cautioned Scipio concerning fortune's fickleness, informing him that a triumph contemporary could readily transform into catastrophe subsequently. He sounded depleted. Scipio attended respectfully, gazed at him in the optical organ, and declined. He articulated, "You initiated this combat. Presently, you must finalize it." They rode returning to their formations. Nothing remained to articulate. Hannibal executed his terminal strategy: 80 war elephants. This constituted the most substantial elephant corps he had ever constructed. His strategy was straightforward and brutal: propel the organisms straight into the Roman central region, crush their formation, and permit the infantry to finalize the survivors. Yet Scipio had been anticipating this. He had observed what elephants could execute, and he possessed a solution based on physical mechanics, not force. He organized his legions not in the traditional checkerboard configuration, yet in columns with extensively accessible lanes traversing straight through the military force. He concealed these lanes with light skirmishers, so the Carthaginian operators couldn't observe them. When Hannibal issued the signal, the terrain trembled. 80 elephants propelled forward. As they approached, the Roman skirmishers propelled thousands of trumpets simultaneously. The noise was deafening. Some elephants experienced terror immediately, rotating, returning, and trampling Hannibal's own cavalry on the flanks. The organisms that persisted propelling contacted the Roman formation, yet rather than colliding into a barrier of protective devices, they discovered vacant territory. The Roman combatants simply repositioned aside. The elephants, pursuing the route of minimal resistance, traversed harmlessly down the lanes Scipio had fabricated. As they traversed, Roman combatants propelled lances into their soft lateral regions. The unstoppable force had been nullified by vacant territory. With the elephants departed and his cavalry routed, Hannibal was compelled into an infantry conflict. His veterans from Italy combated with the desperation of individuals who recognized there was no withdrawal. They were actually propelling the Romans returning. For an instant, it appeared like Hannibal might execute one terminal supernatural occurrence, yet then Cannae's apparition returned. The Roman cavalry, having pursued the Carthaginians from the terrain, rotated around and returned. They crashed into Hannibal's military forces posterior. It constituted poetic compensation. Scipio had utilized Hannibal's own signature maneuver, the encirclement, against him. The master was vanquished by his own instruction. 20,000 Carthaginians expired. Hannibal, observing the collapse, escaped the terrain to urge the Senate to capitulate. He informed them the truth. I haven't merely forfeited an engagement, I have forfeited the combat. Carthage capitulated. The stipulations were humiliating. They were obligated to incinerate their naval fleet, 500 vessels in the harbour, a combustion that could be observed for distances. They were obligated to remit a colossal indemnity, and most significantly, they couldn't conduct combat without Rome's authorization. Carthage ceased existing as a superpower and transformed into a client state. The nocturnal terror was terminated. Rome had triumphed. Yet for Hannibal, the combat's termination was not his chronicle's termination. Persistence, it transpired, would constitute a punishment more severe than mortality. You would conceptualize the chronicle terminates at Zama. The antagonist forfeits, the protagonist triumphs, and the acknowledgements rotate. Yet chronology is infrequently that sanitary. Hannibal didn't expire at Zama. He returned to Carthage and executed something even more surprising. He acquired an administrative assignment. He was elected as a suffet, a principal magistrate. And precisely like on the battlefield, he was a genius. He extracted corruption, reformed the taxation system, and reconstructed Carthage's economy so rapidly that within several chronological years, they proposed to remit their complete combat debt to Rome in a singular aggregated sum. This terrified Rome. They comprehended that Hannibal Barca didn't require elephants to constitute danger. As extended as he was animate, he constituted a threat, so the Roman extremists insisted on his apprehension. Hannibal recognized they were approaching. He escaped into the nocturnal period, commencing a catastrophic wandering exile that would persist for approaching 20 chronological years. He travelled from kingdom to kingdom in the oriental regions, Syria, Crete, Armenia, Bithynia, proposing his services as a military consultant to anyone who would combat Rome. He transformed into an apparition, a terrifying figure haunting the cartographic peripheries. He was the chronologically advanced feline predator, dentition absent, yet continuously vocalizing, attempting to ignite one terminal combustion to incinerate the Roman Republic. Yet the world had progressed forward. The monarchs he served didn't attend to him. They utilized his designation for prestige, yet disregarded his counsel. Ultimately, in 183 BC, the confinement network was sealed. Hannibal existed in Bithynia, in contemporary Turkey. The Romans pressured the local monarch to relinquish him. Combatants encircled his residential structure. Hannibal verified the secret exits. They were all obstructed. He didn't experience terror. He had been transporting his escape strategy with him for chronological years. He donned a circular band with a secret compartment containing a lethal dosage of toxic substance. He gazed at the toxic substance and vocalized his terminal vocalizations documented by chronology, with a caustic sense of irony. Let us alleviate the Romans from the apprehension they have so extensively experienced. Since they conceptualize, it examines their tolerance excessively substantially to anticipate and chronologically advanced individuals' mortality. He consumed the toxic substance and expired. He was 64 chronological years. So who triumphed? On cartography, Rome triumphed. They obliterated Carthage to terrain in 146 BC, applying sodium chloride to the terrain, so nothing would ever cultivate there once more. They transformed into the Mediterranean's masters. Yet in cognitive apparatus, Hannibal triumphed. He fundamentally transformed Rome's genetic code. Before Hannibal, Rome was a regional authority with a citizen, its militia. To vanquish him, Rome was obligated to transform into a military apparatus. They were obligated to normalize the concept of a permanent military force, of commanders with unconditional authority like Scipio, Sulla, and ultimately Julius Caesar. The apprehension of another Hannibal fabricated the Roman Empire. It fabricated them merciless, paranoid, and expansionist. They conquered the world not because they desired to, yet because they were terrified that if they terminated, another monster would arrive over the Alps. Hannibal Barca didn't obliterate Rome. He compelled Rome to obliterate its own republic to persist. He fragmented their cognitive apparatus, and in executing so, he configured the Western world's chronology permanently. If this exploration into antiquity's supreme tactician's cognitive apparatus resonated with you, please impact that appreciation mechanism and subscribe, and inform me in the commentary sections. Do you conceptualize Hannibal was a protagonist, combating for his residential location, or an antagonist who sacrificed his population for a vendetta? Until subsequent temporal instant, recollect, chronology isn't exclusively dates and cartography. It's the chronicle of how the past configures who we are contemporary.